Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have had to discontinue our in-person events and instituted these online seminars or webinars in place. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we are now dependent on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our local staff. You can donate at www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is we're honored to have as our speaker Grahame Russell, who will be talking about why so many thousands of Central Americans are forced to flee their homes, their families, and countries, and to do this year after year, decade after decade. It's astonishing and tiring to read month after month reports about the forced migrancy situation and not read a single explanation about how the US and Canadian governments and other actors in the so-called international community maintain full and beneficial economic, political, and military relations with the very regimes and economic elites in Guatemala and Honduras that are responsible for the conditions forcing people to flee. Grahame Russell is author with Catherine Nolan of Testimonial Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala. And he will connect the dots between forced migrancy and military coups, for export production, and the lack of human rights and labor and environmental standards. He'll also give concrete examples from the community defense versus mining struggles that Canadian companies are involved in. Russell is a non-practicing Canadian lawyer and adjunct professor at University of Northern British Columbia and the director of Rights Action. So let me give the floor to him and explain that there will be opportunities for question and discussion afterwards. But for now, take it away.
Thank you very much, Cliff. And thank you for the center for having me to zooming in. I'm pretty sure that this topic is quite familiar to many of your listeners. So what I want to do today is give quite a quick overview, a summary framework of understanding for these issues, without going specifically into detail in the presentation part in any particular issue. I'd rather get out a general overview of my understanding of the issues and then see where the discussion goes after. And because I'm going to whip through a lot of points, I am making generalizations. And I will be skipping over a lot of points. And so feel free to ask me to clarify what I was saying about a certain point, or feel free to disagree as well with the general nature of my analysis. But the question is, why are so many people forced to flee year after year, decade after decade? The focus of the talk is Honduras and Guatemala, but I think the analysis applies to many countries across Latin America, many countries across Africa now, and other parts of the global South. I think Guatemala and Honduras might be particularly egregious situations, but they're not unique. And these are phenomena happening across the globe now. And I think to begin with the conclusions in the broadest terms, the reframing is fundamentally that these are not nation state issues. They're not national issues. These are phenomena of our global political system and our global economic order.
I'm reading this too.
Oh, there's someone coming in. And so that is my general conclusion, is that the refugee problem, the forced migrancy problem from Guatemala and Honduras are not Guatemalan or Honduran problems. They are local to global problems all at the same time. They need to be addressed that way. It's the only way. If ever we're to remedy the problem, there needs to be fundamental transformation, both at the local and national levels in countries like Guatemala and Honduras, but very much there needs to be serious transformation in the politics and the economics of the policies and the military and economic policies and actions of the rich and powerful countries. And if not, this cycle is just going to repeat itself as it has been repeating itself for generations. As a general overview point, there's deep history at play in all of this stuff in Central America, and I think many people will be familiar with this. But so just to give my take on what I mean by the deep history at play, centuries of Western European-led imperialism and colonialism, including the slave trade, led to and resulted in the current global political system, which is the nation state system. And it's a very unjust and unequal nation state system that grew out of and evolved from the centuries of imperialism and colonialism that preceded it. And the current global economic system grew out of and evolved from the centuries of European-led imperialism and colonialism. And to simplify things a bit, the global economic system is loosely defined as the global capitalist system, the free market system, the neoliberal system. We can debate the definitions of these points, but it's a very unjust and unequal global economic order that grew out of this same history. And so there's almost a contradiction that's at the heart and center of all this. We have a nation state system of allegedly sovereign independent nation states and one global economy. And the nation state system, the way it operates, rich, powerful countries, poor, dominated countries, exploited countries, actually serves the interests of the unjust global economic system, and helps keep it in place. That is one of my general overview conclusions. And that's my simple version of saying that there's deep history at play. And into all this, the global climate crisis is not something that just came out of nowhere. It came out of this global economic system and this unjust global nation state system. Both the economic system and the nation state system are based on power and wealth accumulation in favor of oneself and domination or exploitation of others. Both the nation state system and the economic system are based on that. And most of the environmental harms and destruction going on across the planet, and now the increasing climate crisis and the heating of global temperatures, are a direct product of these same 500 years of history. And then the refugee flight comes out of the same system, is a product, is a cause and effect. It's an effect of this same unjust, unequal nation state system and global economic system. And that's where Honduras and Guatemala fit into all this. So that's my conclusion. And those are my general overview points. And I'm going to get now more into specifics as to what rights action does, and just a few specific examples that I do think serve to prove the points I was making. And just in case anyone is wondering, this is not my own thinking, and these ideas are not new. In terms of the deep history at play, my favorite book still today about Latin American history would be Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. I still think it's as useful a book, even though it was written in the early 70s, it's still as useful a book as any that sort of sets out clearly this deep history, the centuries of European imperialism, colonialism, and then the creation of the modern nation state system, and keeping in place all the same systems of economic exploitation, racism, and that the local economies are always in service of the global economy. I think Open Veins of Latin America does that as well as anything I've read, though many authors and writers have sort of built on that same thing and enriched it and deepened it since then. If one prefers Hollywood to academic-based history books, one could look at The Hunger Games. And I read The Hunger Games a few years ago because at a given point my kids were reading them and then watching the movies. And the first book of the Hunger Games is as instructive about all this stuff. It's and a little bit more easy reading in some ways, but it's based on the simple premise of the capital and the districts and the role of the districts, where there's all kinds of poverty and repression to keep in place and exploitation to serve the interests of the capital. And I think that is how the global economic order works in many ways. Again, it's a simplification, and there's a lot of different levels of grayness in it. But I think The Hunger Games, in particular, the first book, is a quite instructive look at what I'm talking about. And then just in more recent history, the co-host of Democracy Now!, Juan Gonzalez, he wrote a book called Harvest of Empire: History of Latinos in the United States, and then it became a documentary film, Harvest of Empire: The Untold Story of Latinos in the United States. And many of the same ideas are expressed there. Like, how is it and why is it that so many Latin Americans have been, particularly Central Americans, Mexico has its own particular history because it's so close to the United States, but particularly Central Americans, but why is it that generation after generation, so many Latinos have been forced to flee and try and find safe haven in places like the United States or in Canada if they can get there? And Juan Gonzalez said it out there, Harvest of Empire. Like, we are part of the problem. That's all I'm really trying to get at. And this is what we deal with in our work, which I'll come to now. I got involved in Central American human rights, solidarity, justice work in the mid-'80s, and spent 10 years living in the region between 85 and 95, working with a number of grassroots human rights groups and then solidarity groups. And then in 1995, started working with Rights Action. And I've been with Rights Action ever since. We work mainly in Honduras and Guatemala. We've done a fair bit of work in the late 90s and into the 2000s in Chiapas, Mexico, very Mayan-dominated region of Mexico, as many of you will know. And so many of the same issues, cross-border issues with the Mayan-dominated population of Guatemala, much of the same history. And we funded a number of community defense struggles in El Salvador that are quite similar to what we do in Guatemala and Honduras, but I'll focus mainly on Guatemala and Honduras. And before setting out what it is exactly that we do, which is quite simple, Guatemala and Honduras have historically been characterized, and I'm going to simplify this. I mean, they're very rich countries in their own way. They have very rich, deep histories, and they're very complex communities and countries and societies in their own way. But as simplifications, I think that the following generalizations are true: that their economies, going back generations, going back through this history of imperialism and colonialism, their economies serve in function of the global economy. That's the bottom line. They long have, and they still do so today. There is local subsistence economy, and people are scraping out a living all over both countries. But the role of the government and the wealthy elites is to offer their economies up in service of the global economy. And so over the years, the types of struggles that rights action has been involved with have to do with the maquiladora industry, the sweatshop industry. We've been dealing with struggles related to the mining industry and the construction of hydroelectric dams. There's many community defense struggles related to for export food production, African palm, sugarcane, bananas, pineapples, coffee. And then there's community defense struggles related to tourism, and then more recently, these so-called model villages, these privatized model villages that are cropping up here and there. All of these are elements of the global economy. Guatemala and Honduras are not a leader in any one of these sectors. They're simply just a piece of pie in the global economy. And the wealthy elites and the governments that are in place make their country available for that. And if people are in the way, then they'll be dispossessed of their land one way or another, corruption and violence. So it's a characteristic of both countries. Their economies serve the global economy. Characteristic of the country, deep poverty, endemic poverty that's resulted from dispossession and exploitation. Poverty is not a God-created phenomena. If one believes in God's religions, it's not a natural phenomena. It comes through exploitation, human rights violations, and great economic inequality. Both countries have been historically and today characterized by repression, both government sector repression and private sector repression. And I'll come back to the role of international companies a little bit later. Both countries in the past and today are deeply characterized by race-based violence and discrimination, gender-based violence and discrimination. Both countries, and these are simplifications, have deeply manipulated democratic systems. Both countries have deeply manipulated legal systems in place. And this is a point I harp on a lot, because when I come back to the role of the Canadian government, the US government, our companies, our banks, our investors, they always say that they're abiding by the democratic will of the democratically elected government of these countries. They're always abiding by the rule of law in our business dealings. And it's fundamentally not true. They're very manipulated democratic systems, electoral systems on the one hand, and then legal systems on the other hand. Impunity, as another characteristic, impunity governs or characterizes most of the actions of the political, economic, and military elites. And by impunity, I mean they can commit crimes, they can commit human rights violations and fundamentally get away with it, as they do. And then corruption. Corruption is endemic to the functioning of the daily lives and the actions of the economic, military, and political elites. Corruption has infiltrated all branches of the government in varying degrees, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judiciary, and it's infiltrated the police and the military in varying degrees. Those are the characteristics. They're simplifications, they're generalizations. I invite people to sort of ask me to be more specific. In every one of those areas, there's very good examples of people fighting back against all of this stuff. And there are good politicians, there are good judges, there are good lawyers, there are good prosecutors, et cetera, trying to do their best. But they're in very compromised situations. These are the conditions that force so many people, generation in and generation out, to flee. So what do we do chipping away at it? Rights Action's a very small US and Canadian-based not-for-profit, and we do two main things. We directly fund what I can loosely call community defense struggles. And community defense struggles are land and territory defense struggles. They're human rights defense struggles, they're environmental defense struggles, and they're defense of local economy, all of the above. And people are fighting hard to stay on their lands because generally they are in the way of development as it's framed by the wealthy elites, whether they're international or local. And they are going to be in the way of development if and when a sector of the global economy, usually the global economy, wants their land. either because it's rich land to grow something on it, it's rich land for tourism, or it's rich land because there's something underneath that the global economy wants, mineral resources, or to get them away from riverbeds because they want to privatize a river for irrigation or for building a hydroelectric dam. So we directly fund community defense struggles. Most of them are indigenous based, or in the case of the Garifuna people in the north shore of Honduras, sort of African descendant indigenous based, but many of them are Ladino based as well. These are poor people who've been living on their lands for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years in some cases, and they're being forced off their lands because of one or more sectors of the global economy. So there's an element of direct funding. The other element of our work is education, political activism, and legal work, if and when possible, trying to hold accountable the governments and or intergovernment agencies and or private companies and banks of Canada, of the US, of the global economy, because we're part of the problem. And that's where the reframing comes in. These are not Guatemalan problems or Honduran problems, narrowly speaking. They're problems of how the unjust global economic and political order works. So we bring the education work back home. And when I said, and so a book like Testimonio, and I'm just going to say this briefly because I'll come back to it in the question and answer period if folks want. Testimonio, this is a book we recently published that brings both these pieces together. Testimonio, the book's called Testimonio, Canadian Mining and the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala. And over the past 18 years, Rights Action, just in one sector of the global economy, the mining sector, we've directly funded and been involved in the activism related to 4 large-scale community defense struggles related to mining companies. And most of these mining companies are Canadian. Some of them are Canadian American companies. There's a Swiss company involved. It's the global mining industry, and Canada's at the heart and center of it. And so we do the direct funding of the communities who are being forced off their lands illegally through corruption because the mining companies want their land to get at what's under it. And then we do our education and activism work, bringing it back home to Canada and the US, saying these are our problems. And I won't go into any more detail right now about Testimonio, Canadian mining, and the aftermath of genocides in Guatemala, but I would answer questions about it in the Q&A period. But it's simply an example of the point I'm trying to make when addressing why so many people are forced to flee. It's the unjust global economy at play. It's the unjust, unequal nation-state system at play. And mining is just an example of that, supported by the Canadian government, supported by the US government, supported by the World Bank, supported by pension funds and investors around the world, contributing directly to this. So just to summarize that, besides the direct community, the direct funding of community defense struggles, we do all of our education and activism work aimed at the so-called international community and how the international community is fundamentally part of the problem. And in the case of Guatemala and Honduras, that means primarily the United States government historically, but it also means significantly the Canadian government and then certain key governments in the European community. And then it means the US military, primarily. They are the #1 supporters of these military regimes in Central America, let alone elsewhere in Latin America. And then it means the World Bank. It means the Inter-American Development Bank. It means the International Monetary Fund. And it means a whole host of sort of private companies and banks that are involved in the various sectors of the global economy that I mentioned. Part of the reframing, and I'm going to wind this up soon to open up a discussion. So then part of the reframing is not just to simply say that refugees are fleeing the conditions that all of this created, but it's sort of reframing the poverty of Honduras and Guatemala. The poverty of Honduras and Guatemala is not Honduran and Guatemalan poverty. It is poverty of this unjust global economic system, this unjust nation state system. This doesn't take responsibility away from the elite powers in Guatemala and Honduras. They're simply partners of the rich and powerful countries like Canada and the US. They're partners of the rich global economic actors. And so it's redefining what are the underlying causes of poverty in a place like Guatemala and Honduras, to say these are local to international problems all at the same time. It's redefining who is carrying out violence in Guatemala and Honduras. The repression is not simply of the Guatemalan state and Honduran state. And I'll talk about Honduras in the question and answer period, because there's been a significant change in government that began this year that's opening up some small space for positive change. But the repression of the Guatemalan and Honduran state in the last umpteen generations is US repression as well. When the US is fundamentally underwriting, training, and arming those militaries and police forces, that is US repression as well. And in the private sector, when repression is used in any one of the sectors I mentioned, maquiladoras, mining, African for export food production, tourism, model privatized villages, that's international violence right there and then. It's not just Honduran or Guatemalan violence. The fundamental lack of democracy in Guatemala and Honduras is also an international phenomenon. When our governments support coup d'etats, which they have going back over 100 years in Latin America, and in Central America, poor Central America has suffered the worst of it, possibly, arguably, over the last 150 to 200 years of US domination. When we overthrow governments, we're destroying their democratic processes by definition. When they carry out corrupted elections, as Honduras did for the last 12 years, every 4 years they had a charade of democracy, and they had deeply corrupted, violent elections. When they carry out these corrupted elections, and then the Canadian and US governments endorse them as democratic governments abiding by healthy, vibrant electoral systems, we are contributing to and benefiting from the lack of democracy in these countries. And the same example for the lack of rule of law. When the Canadian government, US government turned a blind eye to the corruption that's infiltrated all branches of these governments that we're supporting and calling democratic, and they are using corruption and using the rule of law actually as a tool of repression, to give out illegal mining licenses, or to criminalize and jail human rights defenders, land defenders, etc., Canada and the US are contributing directly to the undermining of the rule of law in these countries. When our companies take advantage of, use corruption, act corruptly, or then take advantage of the rule of law to their advantage, our companies and investors are contributing directly to the manipulation and weakening of the rule of law and democracy. So the reframing goes to that level, that this Canada and the US are directly contributing to the poverty of many people in Guatemala and Honduras. We're contributing to the violence, we're contributing and benefiting from the corruption and impunity. That's my reframing of why so many people are forced to flee Honduras and Guatemala. I think the analysis is legit in general terms. I'm very much open to sort of the Q&A and asking people to clarify, asking me to clarify certain points, or, take issues with certain points. I do think the analysis works unfortunately, in many other countries around the world. Guatemala, in recent years, have been sort of extreme examples for all the wrong reasons, and that's too bad for the people, for the majority populations of Honduras and Guatemala, and that's why so many millions have fled over the last 12, 15 years, millions. Most years it's tens of thousands of folks, some years it's been hundreds of thousands, and when you add up the years, we're talking about millions who have fled just in recent years, let alone if you go back to Juan Gonzalez's work with Harvest of Empire, the millions that were forced to flee in the late 70s and 80s because of US-backed military regimes. These are repeating cycles of people who are being forced to flee because of local to global factors. That's the reframing that is absolutely missing in just about any mainstream media coverage in Canada and the US. And by always misanalyzing what's going on in these countries, the Canadian and US media is helping contribute to the reproducing of the same problems. And there is no, I'm going to end off on a glum note, in a sense, there's no end to this in the near term future. Unless we bring about the long-term transformational work, not just in Guatemala and Honduras, but in Canada and the US as well, to transform how we live together as people on this planet. And then the good note is, and I think anyone who's listening to this will know, that there's tons of very creative, courageous work being done on all of these issues that I'm talking about, both in Canada and the US, but also throughout Central America, let alone beyond. So I'm going to leave it at that, Cliff, to open it up for discussion. And I'm just interested to see where the discussion goes.
Okay, well, thank you, Grahame. Since there are some people who are watching this on YouTube, not able to get your questions to us directly, you will have to send them by email to global.justice.cliff.com. And I'll pass your questions and comments on to those in the Zoom room. But those who are here in the Zoom room, and we do have a good number of people, if you have anything to say, just raise your hand or wave at me, and I'll be happy to call on you. I see an old friend here, Jean Stoken. Haven't seen her for a couple decades or more. So welcome, Jean.
I see two questions in the chat. Why don't I jump in with one of those? Does that work for you, Cliff? Is it, Cliff, if I see a couple of questions in the chat, should I just pick up on those questions?
Oh, sure. Yes,
right.
I wasn't watching the chat.
So one question is from Graham Thompson. How can we connect the dots of a movement for change? I mean, I think that would be like movements for change. I think those dots people have been connecting them for decades now. Certainly, it's not like I was the first wave in the 80s of people who are connecting the dots. I think my favorite book on this would actually, as a North American, I'm actually a US citizen and a Canadian citizen. My favorite book on this would be Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, where you see the work that people have been doing going back centuries, connecting the dots. And so and their movements for change, as opposed to one movement for change, I think they're happening all across the planet, and they're never happening fast enough. But I think they're happening all across the planet. They're usually driven by community-based grassroots movements. In my experience, certainly in Central America, the connecting of the dots is not coming from the governments for the most part. And the connecting of the dots is not coming from large-scale NGOs, whether they're in the human rights field, the large-scale environmental field, or the large-scale development sector, but they are coming from solidarity groups, small-scale NGOs working on this range of issues, and usually because they're working directly with community-based struggles in the countries in question. And the connecting of the dots. And this is why I said earlier that the vision I'm setting out here, the analysis, is not new. It's not like Grahame or Rights Action invented this. we learned this from other groups. I learned this from other people who I started working with in the 80s and early 90s, and they've been doing it for decades already. And so all the work of creating movements has to come through the shared analysis of the local to global nature of the problem. And so perhaps that's the answer to the question, how to connect the dots, is that whether one's working on these types of issues in El Salvador or Mozambique or the Congo or Indonesia or Guatemala or wherever, is the reframing of them and always setting out the local to global nature of the issues. And I wouldn't dare to say that in every one of these struggles going on across the planet, they're all local to global by definition, but invariably most of the serious struggles are local to global. They have to do with unjust nation state system. They have to do with ongoing imperialisms around the world. They have to do with the unjust global economic order. And again, that's a generalization. But I think it's generally true. It's certainly true in Central America. And perhaps the movement that's actually making some of the most headway has to do with the environmental struggle and the increasing sort of climate crisis and slash environmental harm and destruction going across the planet. Because all across the planet, I think you can see movements of people, and it's usually the poor people that suffer climate harm and climate crisis and environmental devastation. They're not saying, oh, this is just a Canadian climate crisis or a Canadian environmental problem. It's a global environmental climate crisis by definition. That is opening up, I think, sort of avenues of understanding. And I think that's all that a little group like Rights Action is trying to do when you take on something like military repression in Central America, is just to say this is a problem of US militarism in Central America. That is US violence as well. When we address the issue of poverty and the people being devastated by mining companies, we're saying that's a Canadian problem as well. I don't think, we're certainly not doing anything new, but I think that's the avenue to creating movements when you start to get a common language, as opposed to saying, oh, this is a Guatemalan problem, or this is a Canadian problem, or this is a Mozambique problem. These are common problems, most of them happening in many different places on the planet. And I think that's one way to help strengthen movements.
I see Mark Ginsburg has his hands up.
Graham, thank you very much. I agree in general terms with your analysis, which you've done a masterful job of summarizing. I'm curious to what extent you can speak to the extent to which migrants from Honduras and Guatemala that you've had interaction with, or your organization has, have come to understand their situation in global, from a global perspective, similar or related. In other words, are they migrating to leave a problem in order to get to the promised land? Or do they see the US, Canada, to some extent Mexico perhaps, as part of the problem? And do they, as they begin to settle in, become active in efforts to challenge that system?
Well, I certainly wouldn't speak for all migrants. There's been millions of people forced to flee.
Right. No, I'm talking about those you've interacted with or had a chance to educate.
Well, yes, and educate, and they educate me, and we work together. I know many refugees who have forced migrants and refugees. On some level, it's basically the same thing: forced migrant or refugee. I've known many who have been forced to flee Central America and go to the US, and a significant number know that they're fleeing US-backed repression in the region. They're forced to flee the harms of economic exploitation that has international roots. They're still going to try and flee to have a peaceful place to live in. But there's a significant number, and I wouldn't say all, but who understand that in one degree or another. And on the flip side of that, where we get really rich exchanges in our work is when we support community defense struggles. We sometimes have more access to information about the international bank that's screwing that particular community, the international investor, the international company. All they might have heard of in the case of mining, for example, is the name of a local subsidiary company, Montana Exploradora. All they know is this company called Montana Exploradora is telling them to get off their land. Well, a quick little bit of research and, oh, that's Goldcorp. That is a major Canadian gold mining company called Goldcorp. So that's the connection. So they're telling us their truth. They're being told they're illegal squatters. They have to get off their land. There's going to be evictions. If they resist, there's violence, etc. This is what a book like Testimonial is all about in 4 different struggles. But it's what each one of these land-based struggles is all about, whether it's bananas or tourism or now the model villages or whatever. They don't necessarily know who the global investors or companies are, but they just know that there's a subsidiary or 1 or 2 people who come in representation of the outside economic interests that are forcing them off their lands or threatening violence, etc., through the use of state forces or private security. So then our work becomes, well, let's just share some information. Here's the investor, here's the company, here's the home country. And so the key part of the work is to support them in their community defense struggle, but then do the education and activism right back through, follow the money back home, follow the policy back home. And many sort of solidarity groups and activist groups are doing that same work now all the time, partnering with repression harmed communities, or partnering with communities being harmed and displaced by the global economy, and then doing the education and activism work, following the money, following the policy back to the home country and to the headquarters, the head office of the particular company or investor. And there's just increasing awareness of this stuff. And it's slow, it's trickle up, it takes generations, it takes centuries to turn. It takes centuries to shift this global political system, the nation state system, and the global economy, because it's so deeply entrenched and there's such vested interests at play. But I believe I can't say whether it'll ultimately be successful. This stuff's going to play itself out long after my life, but that's the only way through, I think, is supporting the struggles and then making the local to global connections and demanding local to global accountability and transformation, reform.
Thank you.
Gene Stoken has put a question in the chat. Gene, do you want to tell everyone what your question is?
Sure. Hi, Cliff, and hi, Graham. Just thank you for all your work for all these decades. Just superb work. Could you speak to the issue of the economic zones in Honduras, the ZEDEs? As I understand it, the new progressive government of Castro has wanted to put an end to that. And was it last week that Senator Cardin in the US and another Republican challenged the Honduran government for that? If you could just speak to that.
Well, I will, only in general terms, and I wouldn't doubt it, Gene, if you know more about the particular battles that are going on in Honduras. I know where I'd like to answer that question is starting from the general again and then going to the specific. But in the general terms, and this is what coup d'etats are for. And so this is part of the point I'm trying to get at in reframing the discussion of why refugees, so many people are forced to flee their home countries, and like Honduras, decade after decade. Well, this is why coups happen. So this is why Canada and the US supported, this is one more reason why Canada and the US supported a coup in 2009, because we wanted to get rid of a government who was starting to implement some mild reforms in the direction of their economy. We wanted to put back in power a government, happened to be a narco-trafficking government. That wasn't a problem. That was going to enable Canadian and US companies and investors to have more access to most sectors or any sector of the Honduran economy that they wanted. And traditionally, when one thinks of that, one thinks of the banana empires, the African palm and sugarcane empires, the coffee empires, and then more recently, like we've documented, the recent wave of mining. All of that's true. But then all of a sudden you realize the global economy is everywhere at all times, and they're looking for ways to make a profit or ways to invest in profit in any element of the global economy whatsoever. So on the north coast of Honduras, and the roots of this stuff go back before the coup in 2009, but the coup just accelerated everything because it was a very the regime that we helped bring into power in 2009, and it was in power for almost 13 years, was, overtly open for global business. And they had billboards around the country, like within days of the coup, saying Honduras is open for business. And so the investment in the tourism sector and the investment in these things called, the model villages, model cities, ZEDEs, free trade zones, whatever they're called, multiple things, but they all come down to a very definable issue. They just they took off on steroids, and so these model cities, and I don't know a lot about them and their background. I just know how they're playing themselves out in Guatemala. I'm not saying that they were invented in Guatemala and they haven't existed in other countries, but basically a group of wealthy investors, and in this case, they're mainly US-based investors, will look at a prized piece of land. And in this case, one of them is on the north shore of Honduras. It's beautiful Caribbean beachfront land. And they will literally, and this is what's going on right now, is they're trying to carve out pieces of Honduras, whether some of it's on the island of Roatan, some of it's on the North Shore, and they will then create self-governing entities. It's basically like carving out a piece of land and taking it away from Honduras, even though it's still there. And they will do that for profit. So if it's on the waterfront, they're going to have one sector of their local model city economy is going to be tourism, and then the cruise ships and all that, and they'll take complete ownership of it. They'll have their own, within these small borders of this little model city, they'll have their own police forces. They'll even have their own judiciary at the local level, and they'll still have to so-called abide by Honduran law. But when you have a corrupt government in place, it basically hands over the entire slot of land to the investors, and they just carve out a piece of Honduras, and they'll use it. Sometimes they use it, and they'll have even maquiladora sweatshops in there for cheap labor, just a combination of issues. There's 2 or 3 of these that they're trying to push ahead with in Honduras, and they took off on steroids because of the regime in power of the last 12 years. The new incoming government of Xiomara Castro is now trying to roll that back. And I do not know all the details, Gene, and I'll leave it at that, and feel free to add in some of the details if you want. But I think the point for the sake of discussion is that is just one more causal effect that's forcing people to flee their lands. They're being forced off their lands, and where do they go? They either go to the slums in the big cities of Honduras, which is a zero option. They either go as forced migrancy to try and get into the US or Canada if they can, or in certain cases, they'll join narco-trafficking gangs because they can become narco traffickers and make a little bit of money. Those become 3 valid options. And in many cases, the only real options for people who are being forcibly evicted from their lands. Live in the slums and scratch out a living, find a piece of poor land somewhere, and eke out a life at subsistence farming that's tenuous at best and getting worse. Go try and get to the US as part of these, the forced migrancy caravans or traveling alone and roll the dice that way. Or in certain cases, people get into organized crime and everything goes from bad to worse at the local level. So I'm sorry I can't be more specifically helpful on the Zetis. It's an open struggle now. The Garifuna people on the North Shore of Honduras, both on the island of Roatan and on the North Shore, are up in battle against the tourism interests, which overlap with the Zetis, the creation of these model cities. There's more that they're trying to build in the south that I know little about. On Zacate Grande is an island instead of the Gulf on the Pacific side that Honduras shares with Nicaragua. And again, it's a beautiful island just in the Gulf that the wealthy people are trying to get the poor people off to create their own model city there as well. And yes, I mean, advocacy. So then the advocacy. So tons of groups are working on this, chipping away, but they're connecting the dots. And so that brings it back into how I understand what rights actions work is, whether it's Witness for Peace that's doing the work, whether it's the Honduras Accompaniment Project, Honduras Solidarity Network, Honduras Now. People are doing the advocacy to say, look at these senators, they're signing up in support of this the creation of privatized cities, and chipping away and trying to expose it. And at the same time, the incoming government of Honduras, because finally there's a decent government back in power, the government of Xiomara Castro is trying to do everything they can to slow this down, even though they're feeling pressure from global investors, global companies, and then now some US senators trying to bring the pressure to bear. That's a legitimate, very hard battle going on right now. I saw a question about the new Honduran government. Here's a question from Terry Bridges about the new Honduran government and what they will be able to do. Brings it back to the many of the very things that I'm talking about, and they're not going to be able to do very much, and what they're doing I think is amazing. And I am, but there's space for actual political, economic maneuver is very limited, and that has to do with the unjust global nation state system, rich countries and poor, and how and then in the case of Central America, the heavily weighted role that the United States plays, and to a lesser degree Canada plays. But it also has to do with the weight of the World Bank and the weight of the IMF and then global companies. They bring, if they want something in a place like Honduras, privatized cities, they're going to bring all of their weight to bear on the new government of Honduras and tell her, oh, we believe in your democratic change, but don't touch our global investment interests. This is good for your development. It's good for your economy. You need to abide by the rule of law. The very things that we undermined for the past 12 years supporting a military-backed narco government. And so what the government of Honduras is going to be able to do is very limited. And she's dealt a losing hand. She comes into power with a treasury that's been looted. She comes into power with the levels of poverty as high as they've been since who knows how long in Honduras history because of the last 12, 13 years. She comes into power with corruption has infiltrated the judiciary, the police, the military, and the Congress is still dominated heavily by the opposition party, the party that was involved in trafficking drugs, the Nationalist Party. So she comes into power with the institutions of the Honduran society and state against her and the direction she wants to take her government, let alone that a majority of the population in Honduras live in conditions of very serious poverty and the same economic systems in place. The richest land in Honduras is still absolutely controlled and owned by the wealthy landowning elites who then use the land to produce for export food products for the global economy. A fair and just government in a country like Honduras would do massive land redistribution, would expropriate lands, a lot of lands, and start handing them out in land redistribution program to correct the imbalance, but that is just highly controversial and wouldn't get very far. So I think her space for action is very limited. What I do think she has on her side is a lot of energy in Honduran society, despite the poverty, and people who are willing to work very hard in the non-government sector to work with her and to bring about the slow necessary changes. And I think she's very honest. I think she's a very decent person. I think she has huge credibility, and that will go a long way. But what she can achieve in the first 4 years is extraordinarily limited. My best hope is that she picks off small things that they'll be able to achieve. They achieve them transparently, and hopefully she gets reelected or her successor gets reelected to keep the same movement going in that direction. But all of this necessitates the chipping away work in Canada and the US, because if we don't continue to bring pressure to bear on our mining companies, on our sectors of the economy that are interested in the privatized cities, in the tourism, in the for export food production, if we don't connect the dots and make the connection and bring the pressure to bear at home, then our governments and economic sectors are going to do whatever they can to limit or curtail any real reforms that her government will try and bring out. And so the answer to the question, by definition, becomes a local to global response. I don't know if I'm convoluting things too much in my answers.
Bob Stone has a question.
Russell, I am delighted to meet you, and I am moved and humbled by your wonderful talk. We've been trying to do what you've been doing for quite a while, and we need to figure out how to do it better. And I think we need to talk with you on a regular basis to share our struggle. I want to ask two questions, local and global. Aren't you excited about the election in Brazil coming up? It's very ambiguous. We did not expect Bolsonaro to get 43%. The polls all had him down at 34%. But apparently this popular distrust of the LGBTQ agenda, part of Lula's agenda, it has upset a bunch of people down there, and our friends who in the United States are talking about a thing called Christian nationalism. That's obviously one part of it, but something like that is finding its voice in Chile, and with the bad vote on the Constitution, and in Brazil. So first, I just wanted to get an idea about that, your answer to that question. How do we identify and unmask this new fascism? Because that's what you're doing when you basically say okay to excising some indigenous or colored part of the human race. You're saying let's have a Holocaust again, and that's fascism.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my first question. If I could hold off on my next one.
Well, I'll just be very brief on Brazil. Like I sure hope, like I think anyone listening today would hope, is that Lula's party will win. But I think for the very reasons you said, I think it's increasingly, he's not going to, if he wins at all, I hope he does, it's not going to be with some overwhelming majority.
That's right.
And I think these are a sign of the times. And then I think what it does is it, like the whole electoral democracy process becomes such a complicated decision-making mechanism, especially when there's so much inequality and so much poverty on one side and so much wealth arrayed on the other side. And so it's a tough battle in Brazil. And it's, you know, but a Guatemala or a Honduras is just a mini version of a huge Brazil. And the same struggles and the same phenomena that I think I'm talking about in Honduras play themselves out on a much bigger level, a much broader level in a place like Brazil. Brazil as a country would have far more control of what happens inside its borders than Honduras does. Honduras is far more dominated by the US and Canada and the World Bank than Brazil is, but Brazil is still a participating entity in the global economic political order. And that's a very rich and powerful country. And Bolsonaro has a lot of power on his side, and he has a lot of wealth. The wealthy sectors of Brazil arrayed behind him, and they're using that wealth to either defeat Lula, or if he gets into power, to control Congress and control different institutions of the state and society, so that even if he gets in power, his room for maneuver will be, they will try and limit it at every step of the way. But having said that, I still hope that his party wins.
Of course, one of the reasons I want it to win is the new currency that he wants to develop in the Southern Cone countries. It would be like the ALBA effort to set up sharing use value based economies between Venezuela and Cuba, where you need doctors, we got doctors. You need oil, we got oil.
Yeah.
Well, you can do that sort of need-based exchange, which is luminous and beautiful as a prospect, easier if you have a currency to not that as a store of value, but as a medium of exchange. And Lula wants to start a currency called, I think it's called the SUR. I'm trying to learn about it. Do you know anything about it?
No, I'm not following that sort of economic
okay.
policy element of what he's proposing.
Anyway, so far as the international side of your circle, local international cycle, I guess you'd put it, which you and Juan Gonzalez are talking about. I figured out the capitalist exploitation of Cuba with the help of Huberman and Sweezy's book Anatomy of a Revolution that came out right after the triumph in '59. I read it.
Mm-hmm.
And a new book is just coming out here in our language, actually, called Bad Mexicans. And it's a historian out at UCLA who has looked back at the Porfiriato, what we call it, and finds in that period the sort of perfect play of millions analogy to Cuba. And
did you have a second question?
No, well, yes, I do.
Yes.
What do you think of on the global debate side? What do you think of Progressive International?
I don't think I know them. I don't know that organization. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. We got to keep talking. This is beautiful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your opening remarks. But I'm not, I may talk better than the success rate of our work. There's nothing easy in these struggles. So don't let me mislead anyone as to these community defense struggles that we support and involve with. Most of them, this is a little bit simplistic, but most of them in the short term are losing causes. Like every time we support a community defense struggle, they're already losing. They're losing their land. Their rights are being violated. People are being stuck in jail or worse. And we are chipping away on losing battles. And that's not a self-defeating commentary. It's just sort of a statement about the nature of the type of work, and you're all involved with it as well. And I know Jean, known Jean for years, has been directly involved with it for decades. But I think the trick is, and what I hope one can do is you stick with those battles, because each battle, community defense struggle, is important in and of itself because of the people involved. This is their well-being, this is their livelihood, this is their land, this is their lives. But also because you take that story back and connect it, because most of them are going to be local to global stories, and bring that story back to the local to global and say, this is just one more example of why significant accountability needs to be brought about in the centers of power and wealth in the planet, and then significant economic, political, and military reform has to be brought about in the centers of power. And of course, it's a pipe dream, but that is what these struggles are going on inside the US right now, and inside Canada as well. I think if I can simplify sort of the underlying ethic of everything that I've been involved with, it's we need to work at every step of the way towards fundamental systems and economic, legal, and political systems and value systems of equality, of fundamental equality on the planet between individuals and peoples all across the planet. And there's many aspects, elements that flow from that. But we live in a global order where the systems are based on fundamental inequality, inequality of the nation states, inequality of the capitalist system, rich and poor. So it's transforming. Each struggle, I think, is a transformational struggle going towards more equality and less inequality, just to simplify things. And
Absolutely.
that's the constant message.
Absolutely. Right on. Thank you. Thank you.
If there's anyone on YouTube who'd like to make a comment, this is your last chance. I'll remind you, send an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. But now I see we have a comment from Norma Harrison.
Hi, everybody. I'm in Berkeley, California. I'm a deep communist, third generation. I want to share some comments with you. I hope you enjoy them. I've had them posted in the chat for quite a while here today, but I thought I'd speak them out. We understand the US is a despotic totalitarian autocracy under the color of democracy, freedom, and so on, undergirded by law, about which a nice article has been posted by a person who does this regularly, it turns out, in Harper's. I've put the link in the chat and invited that if you cannot link directly to the article, that it says that you have to get a membership or something, you can ask me and I'll send it to you. And I've put my email in. Further, it is integral to the American, as it were, the US system, that sectors of society are persecuted, materially deprived, one step removed just verbally from chattel slavery to the benefit of our owners. All the conflicts against nations by the US hegemony and all the resistance here in the US have been caused by our owners' constant fear of the Bolshevik Revolution. 110 years of resisting liberation struggles anywhere. It is right for our owners to have been in constant fear. Communism, nevertheless, is creeping in throughout the world. Hello, Robert.
Hi.
Well, thank you for that. Without getting into like like defining narrowly or even broadly the notion of communism itself, I do think that the constant preoccupation is the fear of any society, nation state, or project that's going in a different direction than that of the sort of the hierarchical capital accumulation model that the US is sitting on top of. And so they will see as a threat any system that goes in a different direction and takes away their access to resources or the possibility of resources or wealth in one form or another. And I don't think, so we could go on for hours about this, but in the Central American context, years ago, the book was written, Nicaragua, Danger of a Good Example. Nicaragua is like a tiny little economy. It's an economy the size of nothing in the United States, but the simple fact that they were going to, go in a different direction like Cuba did. These economies are tiny. They're minuscule for the US driven notion, but the global sort of economic driven notion. Canada supports this vision, the World Bank does, etc. Any little example is worth spending time on to undermine, weaken, or try and push back, let alone if it's a big country that carries more weight and power. And this is why the US and Canada and global businesses would be far more concerned about a Lula victory in Brazil than they are Xiomara Castro in Honduras in the short term. The fear is the same, but the weight of taking Brazil's economy in a different direction is far more significant to global capital dominated by the rich countries of the North.
They even have to support Iran's horrible arrangement against women because any liberation is frightening.
And so we chip away. Bob,
I don't think it's just chipping away. I do think that there is a kind of undercurrent of the communist mentality. The big thing about communism, like for the USSR, Cuba, and all, it changes people and it changes them permanently. Oh, we can, in any place that it goes on. Oh, we can struggle for liberation, regardless how much they kill us.
Oh, I agree with your statement. Like I just say we chip away because of the context in which I'm working in Guatemala and Honduras right now. But the goal and the direction is very similar to push, to get the sort of the greedy, violence-driven, corrupt-driven interests out and rebuild or build for the first time something that's locally controlled, that responds to local need, that produces and ensures local well-being, but one that's in balance with the local economy. And if that's just in one village or municipality, or that's in a whole country, that's what they're fighting for, right?
It's really hard for people to envision going in that direction. We're so accustomed to these monstrous control devices, the systems, that looking at trying to create alternative society, somebody once described it, they said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But it's necessary for us to see what we're talking about. Well, we're talking about not going backward to some previous system. We are talking about reducing the size of some hegemonic control of how we live.
Agreed.
And thank you very much. I certainly appreciate, I mean, all the groups that work at that level. It's wonderful that they keep on. I can't work at that level.
No, and thank you for that. But whether it's chipping away or not, it's just a phrase I use. I believe in all of our efforts that are.
But that's right.
Direction.
No, that's right. I don't mean to disagree with that at all.
Right. Cliff, I'm quite happy to leave it at this, unless there's any final questions.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So, yeah, I want to give you thanks, Graham. I enjoyed your informative presentation. Hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, which are accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. And I hope you'll join us again for our next webinar. Political scientist Harry Targ will be rethinking the peace movement. And I think you'll find that a very interesting and relevant discussion. So let me close by giving thanks to our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.
Before everybody closes out, did anybody find out for Robert whether there was a radio someplace? It was posted in the chat. Maybe people didn't see it. He said there was a radio going on. I wonder if they figured it out. Anyway, goodbye.
Everybody was on mute, so I don't know where that.
Robert wasn't, and nor were you.
No.
Okay, bye.
Okay, thank you.